Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Do It with Rio podcast. I'm really excited today to have Edwin join us. Edwin is from Include Consulting. Hey, Edwin, why don't you jump in and introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks. My name is Edwin. I am a diversity and inclusion consultant at Include. Been here for about a year already, but prior to that, my background has always been in recruitment and talent management, both in multinationals as well as in startups. I'm also outside of work really passionate about gender equality and inclusion. Hence, I'm part of the leadership team at Lean in Singapore as well, which is a huge volunteer organization. So that's just a little bit more about the work that I do.
Awesome. I've done a bit of work with Lean In here in Malaysia, and so is my wife. She's quite heavily involved. It's a fantastic organization to be in. But today we're going to be talking about diversity and inclusion. And I've always had mixed feelings about diversity and inclusion. I think I've met people at companies and worked for companies myself who have, when it comes to diversity and inclusion, they've just done the surface level fluffy stuff. They've done what they need to do in order to tick a box to say that they've done it. And
Mhm.
I've even come across even worse companies that by doing this diversity and inclusion program, they've done it badly, and it's had a fairly negative effect on the employees, what the employees think about diversity and inclusion, and the overall performance of the company. So when I first started talking to you when we met a few weeks ago, I was very curious. What made you move from recruitment consulting into diversity and inclusion consulting?
Yeah, good question. So I would actually say moving into diversity and inclusion has always been a passion area of mine ever since I started my career at Microsoft APAC. Because when I joined, there was actually a diversity and inclusion team here in Singapore. Actually, literally one person who is such a great mentor of mine. And when I got exposed to the work that she was doing and highlighting a lot of the inequalities as well as the inequities that exist in our workplaces, it really didn't sit well with me, and I knew that this was something that I really wanted to change. But I also knew that in order to influence and to be able to move the needle in a full-time role that will enable me to do diversity and inclusion will require business acumen and years of experience. And for me, picking up recruitment and other forms of, like, in the space of HR was just helping me to gain experience to help me pivot into this role today. And what was also really useful in, for example, when I was spending 2 years at Deliveroo, yes, my main full-time role was recruitment, but because there was so much scope that needed to be covered, I was able to develop, unconscious bias training for our hiring managers and even sexual harassment training and just being
Mm,
part of the diversity and inclusion committee there. And that gave me a lot of room to practice a lot of this D&I stuff that I do on the side as well,
mm.
apart from just hiring great people.
Yeah, that's
So
that's the great thing
things
about
somewhere.
being in a startup. You get the chance to double hat in so many areas, and often those
Absolutely.
areas are driven by what your passion is. Mm. So as I mentioned, I've come across companies who have just done it so badly. And when I was thinking about your background, with recruitment, almost all companies need recruitment, and they rely on recruitment services. And they might not like headhunters, but they know they have to use them. With inclusion and diversity, it's not always that simple. It's not necessarily something that every company thinks that they need. And as I mentioned, some employees are really put off by bad experiences in the past. When you're consulting with a company and looking at implementing a diversity and inclusion program, how do you deal with employees that have had a bad experience in the past, that do feel like this is just something the company is doing and it's a waste of my time, it doesn't really impact it? How do you get them on board? Because you do need them on board, right?
Yeah. So I would say the first thing I would do for people who have had a bad experience, for example, what we do find is that the intent is always good, right? But
Mm,
however, the delivery and how it lands and the impact could be ending up in mixed results. For example, what we tend to see is tokenism, right? We tend to
mm,
see, oh, we need to hire a person from a minority group. And even though this person might not be there, might not be meeting all the qualities, we'll have to hire this person. And then it signals also to the underrepresented person that ends up getting hired and to the rest of them, like, what are we doing here? Are we trading off, quality for diversity? And then of course this could end up in very bad experiences altogether, or even just company communications, right, around messaging of diversity and inclusion, and even just how it's representing different
mm.
identities companies altogether could land very differently if not checked by the right groups. And then it ends up having the minority person carrying the burden of educating everyone, like, this is why it should be, this is why it's not fair. And it puts a lot of unnecessary burden on the person. And I think, like what you said, it could result in bad experiences. So if I were to encounter someone who's had a bad experience, I think the first thing I need to do is acknowledge that yes, I'm fortunately that's what you've been through in this organization, but I have to also let you know that perhaps they had the right intent, but the delivery of you, and plus the experience that you went through, might not have been ideal altogether. But I think we need to also, once we've kind of met them where they're at, kind of help them to once again see that bigger picture around D&I is the right thing to do, and it's the smart thing to do, because there have been so many really good evidence and research that has shown that diversity and inclusion, when done well, can bring so many positive results. And of course, that is also where, as an individual, if you were sidelined or you had a negative experience, I think it's really important to go back to that again, around like what we see is that gender diverse teams ultimately bring in 25% more revenue than non-gender diverse teams, right? BCG did another study saying that more diverse teams bring in up to 20% more innovation. And I think, like, when you are able to recognize the case for this, and help people understand that, it really just helps to make sure that you've got your own mantra and keep fighting for the good fight, right?
Oh, definitely. But as I said, so many people seem to have this bad experience. Where do you think so many companies mess up, and why do you think so many companies can get this so badly wrong?
So I would say it's two things that ultimately companies really fall short on. So let's say oftentimes D&I is not a priority, right? It's often a trigger, like, oh, somebody complained about something, or somebody said something, or we see news in the media, and then I think we need to run a workshop, or I think we need to do this, and it's very ad hoc altogether. And oftentimes we do think that once this is done, we've solved the problem, we're all kumbaya, we're all happy, we're all good, right? And these are very ad hoc, unproven actions that might actually backfire, resulting in those negative experiences. So I would say the two biggest challenges, and also the two biggest opportunities for most companies to really move the needle on diversity and inclusion and make it work, is firstly, not looking at D&I as a ad hoc kind of initiative, but looking at it at a systemic level, and actually making sure that D&I is embedded into your organizational strategy, right? And how does it align to the mission of your organization, and also in your leadership behaviors as well. And that means setting a framework, that means setting strategies, giving resources, giving funding, holding your leaders accountable, and setting targets altogether. Because only when, what gets measured gets managed, right? So ultimately, that's the one key thing that we see that it's important to really move the needle. Secondly, what we do see is that organizations who at least know that diversity and inclusion is important, they start measuring diversity, right? And that's easy when you look at measuring representation, number of women, number of ethnic groups, etc. And that's easy to track because you can count. But oftentimes what they're not counting or easily able to measure is inclusion. So yes, you have a diverse team, but how included are they? Because we do know that a diverse team does not mean that they're inclusive at the same time. And we know that we need both together. So the question that I ask our organizations that we meet with is, are your leaders able to manage diverse teams inclusively, right? Are you able to also recognize that your processes, from your recruitment, your onboarding, your performance management, they're actually baked with bias favoring some groups over others, and recognizing that you might need to look at it from a lens of how is it going to be much more equitable, much more accountable, and much more transparent. And that's also where we see that organizations really struggle with on this front as well. So to sum up, it's two things, right? They need a really systemic approach, looking at a framework and a strategy and a target and accountability, and then also making sure that they are not only fixing diversity in terms of representation, but also looking at inclusion and equity as well.
Got it. And you mentioned a lot about implementing real, tangible change. And I think, one of the things that I see a lot of companies do is they try to implement, change, but they don't implement it. And I think that's where, a lot of companies, they miss the mark. real strategies and real frameworks. Again, maybe it's because I've been involved in companies that didn't really have those things. D&I sometimes comes across as a list of rules, a list of things that say, don't do this, but you can do this. How do you move a D&I program from that kind of list of things to do or not do into a real framework or a real strategy?
So I actually do have to say that for an organization that's learning to start its journey on D&I, it might actually be a list of do's and don'ts, right? Because think about it, like diversity and inclusion is so new to us. It's almost like riding a bike, right? Riding a bike for the first time. You want to make sure that you're wearing the helmet, you're knowing where the brakes are, you're doing this, and you're not doing that, right? And I do think it's the exact same thing when it comes to diversity and inclusion, because we all have biases. We all operate from it because that's how we cope with the 11 million bits of information in our brain that we're hit every second, and our brain can only consciously process 40, right? So that's also where we need to acknowledge that learning to be inclusive and learning to embrace diversity is very new behavior to us. And therefore, when we start educating individuals about diversity and inclusion, it might be a list of do's and don'ts. So for example, doing would be, how are you practicing inclusive behavior? So for example, what we recommend for you to do in your next meeting is make sure that you are hearing everyone's voices, that you don't interrupt someone else, right? Because we have a tendency to do this without even us knowing. So I can see that in the beginning, it could be actually just sharing with people a list of actions to do, which are inclusive, and a list of actions that you should not ideally do because they create exclusion and inequality altogether. So I can see that once people are much more aware of this and aware of the benefits of doing these things and aware of the implications of, non-inclusive behavior, then it becomes a habit altogether, right? And then I would say that it becomes a habit and then bakes into your culture. And then I would say an organization in itself can be really living diversity and inclusion as its DNA. So I do believe it starts from a list of do's and don'ts in the beginning, but once it seeps into and embeds into the culture, it becomes a way of life already in itself.
No, definitely. And I've read a lot of articles on D&I in general. Some are obviously very, very positive about the impact. Others take a different approach. And, I'm not sure how accurately researched these articles are. But certainly they talk about the dangers of that strict enforcement of diversity and inclusion programs. And point towards evidence that says companies that really do enforce these strict rules actually have a downturn in performance, and it has a negative effect on employees. But if this is true, why do you think it is so important that companies do continue to do it?
I think it goes back to the case for it altogether, right? Like, there have been, what I always love to go back to is always the research and evidence about it. McKinsey has been doing this case for gender and ethnic diversity for years to come.
Yeah.
And also what we find, right, like even when you are as an employer looking to attract the best talent, Gallup has also shown, particularly if you want to attract the best talent, they want to go to organizations which are diverse and inclusive. And if we talk about, looking at internal survey data, people will actually leave, I think about 40% of employees would leave their organization for a more diverse and inclusive one. So from a talent angle, right, if you want to attract the best talent and you want to retain the best talent, diversity and inclusion is super critical and will be a game changer for you, right? And I also think that right now we're living in the great resignation. And one of the biggest reasons why people are trying to leave is because they don't feel a sense of belonging at work altogether.
Got it. And it's I think you've muted your microphone there. But
I'm here.
It's interesting that you bring up talent, because obviously my background is almost entirely recruitment. So my introduction to diversity and inclusion was how can I make my recruitment job easier using diversity and inclusion? How can I create an image of a diverse and inclusive culture at the company to help attract people, and secondly, how to retain people so that I don't have to replace them further down the line. What's your take on using diversity and inclusion as a recruitment tool, not just to retain people, but actually to make sure, and not just to attract people, but also to make sure that you're hiring the right people that are going to fit the culture that you built around diversity and inclusion. Do you think screening tools and assessments in the interview process can really add to the culture of D&I that a company has built?
Good question. So I would say there are proven mechanisms that actually make sure that help companies and hiring managers ensure that you're hiring the best candidate for you. And what has been found is that the most accurate way to test for the right fit of a person is using a work sample test. And that is essentially asking them questions even early on in the application phase. If a question around a task or an assignment that someone in this role would face. So for example, asking them in the application for a marketing role, if you had $20,000 to spend on a marketing budget for Bravo HR or Include, how will you spend it and why? Right. And just asking them up front could actually really help to be able to determine if the person has demonstrated the right aptitude and traits for the job. I'm not looking at where they worked at. I'm not looking about where they studied or what their GPA was or their name or any essential information that could bias me, right? Because essentially, if I look at a CV and I saw that, for example, you were from Google, oh, you must be a good candidate, I'm going to talk to you. But I might be discounting the company, another great candidate from maybe an organization that I don't know so well. But if I'm just focusing on how they responded in that work sample test and how they and how they approach that, I could actually surface much better candidates instead of just looking at their plain resume.
Yeah.
And we actually know that years of experience and years and education isn't the best predictor of whether I'm hiring a good candidate. Another great example of what I can see is also been proven to highlight great candidates is a general mental ability test. So if you are putting in semantic reasoning, or if you are adding in numerical tests, that is actually a highly predictive way of you surfacing good talent altogether. So one of the things that I highly recommend is try to remove any of those qualities that could bias you towards favoring a candidate or unfavoring a candidate altogether.
I mean, unconscious bias is a very interesting subject. With my years in recruitment, I've worked with so many hiring managers who are very consciously biased. They have these quite terrible prejudices. But on the other hand, there's
all do.
definitely. But they also have these unconscious bias that they're not even aware of. And I include myself in that. I think over the years I've made myself aware of these unconscious biases. And one of the problems that I find personally is that once I'm aware of a bias that I have, I start to overcompensate. I start to think I'm judging this person, so I'm going to do the opposite, and that in itself is still a form of bias. So how do you recommend recruiters and hiring managers approach this, and how do you think they should confront not just their conscious bias but also their unconscious bias and make sure that they truly are being unbiased?
Yeah, so I would say that it's just important and to take a step back there, recognizing like what you said, we can't get rid of our biases. We have to learn to live with them. I would say a bigger danger and a group we haven't addressed yet is the people who believe that they don't have it, right? And if someone says to you, I make all my decisions objectively, it is actually more dangerous that because they actually believe that every decision that they make is unbiased and end up, when we have these conversations with them and pointing it out that they've made a certain decision that could be inaccurate or baked with subjectivity, it's a lot harder to convince. So I do think it is important to raise awareness that we have it. And actually using tools like the Harvard implicit bias test can help surface what those biases could be. So for example, for me, I am still biased about men in science and women in arts, or men focus on career, women in family. And this has been proven from the test that I do. And even me working in the space of gender diversity, I fall into this bias trap and I have it all together. So I think it's important that we recognize it.
I think my biggest unconscious bias, or not, it's a conscious bias now, is towards English language. And when I speak to someone who doesn't speak good English, I automatically associate that with lack of intelligence, when of course it's absolutely not true. It just means they can't speak English. And it's something that I personally have struggled to overcome. And I think I have mostly, but it's still there in the background. As you said, you can never truly get rid of these bias.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that I will always recommend everyone is to not think that having bias is a bad thing. We need it. It prevents us getting hit by a bus. It prevents us to avoid getting punched, right? Because it's the unconscious, stereotypic, quick part that really helps us to navigate the world better. But we need to just be aware that when we use these quick judgments and stereotypes on critical decisions like who we hire, that's where we need to realize, are we slow and calculative instead of being fast and judgmental? So going back to the point around how can we make better decisions, I like to use this acronym that we use that includes, it's called SEED, right? SEED. So S stands for stop and slowing down. We know that when we are rushed, when we are exhausted, when we are tired, we feel that we are going to likely tap into our stereotypes altogether. So ask yourself, before you are going to decide who you're going to hire, who you're going to shortlist, ask yourself, are you rushed? Are you stressed? Because we know that if you are, you're likely to rely on stereotypes. So give yourself the space, if you are a hiring manager or if you're a recruiter, to not spend 15 minutes to sift through hundreds of CVs. Give yourself the space to do so and slow down.
Yeah.
E, right? Evaluate. So once you kind of pause, or when you've kind of make a decision, for example, take the time to consciously analyze your decision making and reactions. So you could ask yourself, what assumptions am I making about this profile, right? Are there things about this person that is particularly influencing your impression? Like those things that I kind of like this person or I kind of don't like this person, but I don't know why. That is potentially your unconscious bias at play. Or if you have a strong reaction to something. So kind of take the time to pause and evaluate your current state of mind. Why am I having a reaction to this, for example? And then the next E is all about exploring and looking at different perspectives. And this is where you need to think like a scientist and ask yourself, making this decision or hiring this person, what could be wrong with my decision? And when you're constantly finding faults and thinking, what could be wrong with this? What could be loopholes in my decision about hiring this person? You are constantly then considering the opposite, which has been shown to work, actually. And also, you can then also try another way to say, flip it. So, would I have said the same thing, or would I have hired this person or not hired this person if this person was a male, or if this person was a different race, or this person was much more fluent in English or not fluent in English? And when you're constantly putting yourselves in different perspectives and looking for loopholes in your decision, it really helps you come to a much richer conclusion here. They actually found this proven in courts, where lawyers who constantly challenge their conclusion end up making much better decisions than lawyers that don't. And lastly, once you've come to take different perspectives, decide. D, right? Once you've made an objective, inclusive decision, have the courage and conviction to stick to it. So stop, slow down, evaluate, explore, and decide. So this is what I would recommend if you're in the moment to apply these techniques at every time before you make a decision.
Oh, that's interesting. I'd never heard of SEED before.
But I would just keep it with it. It's just a simple acronym altogether.
You know, I don't have the best memory, so it's always good to have these simple ways to remember things. But Edwin, that brings us to the end of the session. It's been very interesting for me, especially on the unbiased, conscious side and how to overcome it. If anyone who's watching this wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to reach out to yourself or to include?
Yeah, feel free to just reach out to me, Edwin Seah, on LinkedIn. or even follow our company's page on LinkedIn as well. I think what we do is we constantly share a lot of microbites and short videos unpacking a lot of these concepts on diversity and inclusion, because there is an appetite for it. And also, to be very transparent, there are a lot of articles and media talking about it, but present a lot of mixed information or give just a very brief overview of it, and that could leave people feeling very confused. So what we do at Include is just to help unpack concepts together so that you are much more informed to act, to really understand how to navigate your environment better.
That's really interesting. So everyone, thank you for listening to myself and Edwin discuss this topic. I hope you can join us for the next session. And Edwin, thanks again for joining me today, and have a great Friday. Awesome. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.